The line between collecting and overconsumption is fine, but BookTok creators walk it with confidence. There are creators with absolutely massive physical TBRs, collectors who own multiple copies of the exact same book, and people buying books way faster than they can read them. And as someone who loves reading and watches BookTok fairly regularly, I wanted to ask myself some questions. Does BookTok encourage people to consume too much? And where really is the line between collecting and just mindlessly buying? The thing that always shocks me is when people have absolutely massive physical TBRs. If you're unfamiliar with the BookTok lingo, TBRs are basically books to be read, and this can exist in multiple forms. For example, you may have like a note on your phone with a list of books you want to read. Maybe you have them added to favorite in an online store. Maybe you use Goodreads and that's where you mark books as TBRs. But what I want to talk about is the physical TBR, meaning when people buy books with the intention of reading them and then they just pile up in their house, apartment, or whatever. I think all of us book lovers have a physical TBR to some extent. For example, in mine, there are currently, I think, around 5 books and 10 mangas. So I don't know, I feel like this is a pretty fair number, pretty normal, not too much. But on TikTok, you can find people who have 100, 200, 500 books just laying around their house waiting to be read. And obviously, that's quite a lot of books to own and read, so people are making up little like funny games to get through them. Some ideas you'll see quite often is, for example, when people have those like little jars with pieces of paper with titles written on them. The papers or the books are very often color coded, so for example, blue is for fantasy, pink is for romance, and so on and so forth. And instead of looking at their shelf and just picking a book based on that, they draw a piece of paper, read the title, and read that book. There are some variations to that. For example, I see people pack their books in like packing paper and then just writing numbers on the back of the book. And on the papers that they draw, they also only have numbers, so they don't know which book they are going to read until they unpack it.
Okay. And we got number 123. This is what it's wrapped in. Let's see what it is. Gosh, Brie, oh crap. Okay, this was one that I was a little bit worried about, but it's fine. They're interconnected standalones, right? So I got switched and saddled.
I'm not going to lie, this one seems pretty fun. Like, I like the little element of surprise in that. What I also see quite a lot of people do is put all the titles of the books they have in their TBRs on like a spinning wheel and choosing what to read in that way. I kind of get having like a huge physical TBR because when I was a teenager, I was so obsessed with books. Like, I still love reading, but really back then when I was a teenager, I was like absolutely obsessed with reading. And I would spend all of my money on books, all of my allowance and stuff like this. I would just buy books. And I did end up with like a huge physical TBR in my hometown. And honestly, some of them I haven't read to this day because I was buying so much that I couldn't really like keep up with the amount of books I was buying. And to this day, there are so many books in my hometown that are still unread because I feel like I kind of outgrew them, you know, like they seem a little bit too juvenile, or I'm just no longer interested in that type of fiction. So I did kind of end up with a huge collection, and in that collection I have books that I've never read, but they look cool, so like whatever. To be fair, I would probably still do that if it wasn't for the fact that I'm renting, and I absolutely hate moving with books. You know, they are heavy, they take up a lot of space. It's generally just like a huge headache. So whenever I finish a book and I feel like I'm not going to reread that in the next couple of months, I just take it to my hometown and leave it in my room there, so I don't have to worry about it when the moving day eventually comes. Anyways, I totally get buying more books than you can read because I used to do that. And I know that when you're buying them, you're convinced you're definitely going to read them all, but then something new comes out or something catches your attention and you decide to read something else and your physical TBR slowly starts building. On top of that, a lot of BookTok creators get books in PR. I also saw some people take part in some subscription models where they get books on a monthly basis from publishers for a reduced price. So I can imagine that if you take part in all of this, your physical TBR builds much quicker. It can very quickly get to a point where you own more books than you can read, and on top of that, you're still getting PR and subscriptions, and occasionally you'll buy something.
My only reading goal for 2025 is to work on reading down my physical TBR. I have too many books, I've done too many big book hauls, I've got too much publisher mail, and I got overwhelmed and I froze. So now I'm 537 books deep, I've read 22% of them, and I'm just embarrassed. I'm embarrassed. It's giving late stage capitalism, it's giving wasteful, icky, ew, gross.
One TikTok creator whose name is Maddie does something she calls a bookshelf balancing, and basically what it is her talking about how many books she read and got in a given month.
I started this month, I believe, with 213 books on my physical TBR, if I did the math right. On the 1st of January, I read House of Dragons and Barbarian's Hope, which brings me down to 211. Then on the 4th, I read House of Shadows, which brings me down to 210. Or on the 5th, I finally picked up my Held Mail, which, does put me at a bit of a disadvantage because I acquired 4 books. They were Switch Positions, which brings us up to 211, The Everlasting, which brings us to 212.
The video is quite long, so I'm just going to sum it up. She starts the month with 213 books on her physical TBR and ends with 218 books, but she says she unhauled 9 of them. We'll get to what unhauling is in just a few seconds. So she ended up with 209 books on her physical TBR by the end of the month. Now, obviously, Maddie is a BookTok creator, meaning she either does it for a living or at the very least she gets those books in PR. But I still think having 200 books in your physical TBR is a crazy number. I mean, I can imagine it would overwhelm me. I wouldn't know what to read, what to pick up next. So I understand why they have so many games to choose the book, which book to read next, because I would also just not know which one to pick. And it's just my personal opinion, but seeing that the number of books in her physical TBR has only gone down by 4, was it? Yeah, she ended up with 209 books and she had 213 at the beginning. So in a month, it only went down by 4 books. So it's very hard for me to imagine that she will ever get to 0 books in her physical TBR. But the thing I like to see on BookTok, which I don't really see on other hobby spaces on TikTok, is the process of unhauling. Book unhauls is basically people getting rid of books, and this happens for several reasons. For example, someone reads a book, doesn't like it, and decides to unhaul it because they don't want to keep it in their collection. Or something that often happens with especially bigger BookTok creators is that they own multiple copies of a single book. For example, because they bought it and later got it in PR, or they got it in PR and later went to an event with an author where it was required to buy a book to either take part in this event or to have it signed or whatever. Sometimes they also unhaul books which they never got around to reading, the books in their physical TBRs that were never read, either because they decided, they are no longer interested in that topic, or maybe because they started reading it and it wasn't as good as they thought. They unhaul books in different ways. For example, what I saw people talk about is that the books they bought with their own money they try to sell, and the books which they got for free, for example in PR, they donate to their local library. I like how this type of content is in opposition to the massive hauls that we are used to seeing on TikTok, where people buy absolutely crazy amounts of books and then it takes them forever to read that. Unhauls are a nice little break from that. This is something you also don't really see in other hobby spaces, meaning I don't really see many fashion or skincare unhauls, which kind of gives me hope for the BookTok community. And it's one of those things that convinces me that people aren't just mindlessly buying, they are actually curating a collection. So let's get to the topic of collections. Can a massive physical TBR be considered a collection? Because I think the answer is yes and no at the same time. The thing about collections is that they are intentional, trying to buy every new book that's coming out with absolutely no regard for whether you like this genre, whether you like this author, whether that book is good or not. That could hardly be considered a collection. If you're just buying books to buy and own as many of them as possible, it's just simple consumerism in my opinion. However, if you curate that collection, if you decide which books are worth keeping after reading them, for example, in my opinion, that is a collection. Just the sheer fact that you you own a lot of books doesn't mean you're automatically over-consuming them. And this is what a lot of those BookTok creators are doing. Yes, they get a lot of books in PR, they buy a lot of them, but after reading them, they very often try and decide which ones are worth keeping in their collections. But there are creators whose collections are like definitely shocking to a lot of people, and one example is Sarah, who owns, I believe, 30 copies of the same book.
I have a lot of copies of Fourth Wing. I really like this book, and I'm gonna go through my whole collection. It's been a while since I did this, and everyone really liked it last time.
Now, I kind of get having several copies of the same book, especially if they are like special editions with different covers, with different art. I also understand having the same book in several languages. For example, I own The Hobbit in I think 4 languages, because The Hobbit is like anytime I learn a new language, The Hobbit is like the first book I read in that language. I can even understand owning copies in languages you don't understand. For example, I know there are people who try to collect all of the Lord of the Rings books in like all of the languages that it's ever come out in. Like, in my opinion, that is pretty impressive. Like, that's a really nice collection. I would love to have that as well. Where I'm lost is when she says she owns 3 copies of the same like version of the book with the same art, with the same cover, the same edition, all of the stuff, because she panicked bought it even though she already had 2 at home.
Then I have 3 sprayed versions of Iron Flame. One was from the release party, one was required purchase for her tour stop, and then one I panic bought on Black Friday. And then also I have 3 copies of the sprayed first edition. One I got in PR, one was my pre-order, and then one I bought on release day.
I understand collections, okay? I really do. And I am a sucker for a good library. And hers is especially, like, I think it's unique and creative and it looks really pretty. And if I had my own place, I would probably try to build something similar. But when she says she panicked bought a new identical copy, I really think it gets to, like, it becomes overconsumption. Like, it gets to a point where it's no longer about collecting, because if she had already owned 2 identical copies of that book, why does she need a third to kind of like fill in her collection? This is where consumerism comes in my opinion. Even the term she used, she panicked bought it. But panicked because of what? I understand panicking when you are, trying to collect, for example, all of the copies of Fourth Wing, and you see a new cover that you don't have, and even though you read that book, you buy it because it's for the sake of the collection. Like, I totally get that. But if she'd already had 2 copies, identical copies at home, where is the panic coming from? Like, this is where I'm lost. A personal library can be a beautiful thing. It can tell the story of your obsessions, your phases, your interests, but a library is different from a warehouse. And I think that's the distinction I keep coming back to. BookTok isn't inherently a culture of overconsumption. Sometimes it's a culture of curating a collection, of recommending books, of building a personal library. But it can become overconsumption when the goal shifts from curating a collection to owning as many books as possible just to show it off online. At the end, I want to put a little reminder that libraries still exist. If you love reading, but the buying part is too much, whether that's because you don't want to spend so much money on books or because your physical TBR is already overwhelming, you can always just rent a book from a library. Like, I know how ridiculous this is going to sound to some people, but I think we are forgetting about libraries in all of this. TikTok is encouraging us to buy and own, which isn't bad on its own, but it can definitely go too far. And if you build that habit of renting instead of buying, you can save up a lot of money and still have access to whatever it is you want to read. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comments. If you don't know what to watch next, check out this video of mine. Obviously, don't forget to subscribe, and see you in the next one. Bye!